The coming of the cold part one. The sun was never in a hurry anymore. It rose late, and went to bed far too early. Day by day, the light grew thinner, weaker, like an old man trying to lift a heavy weight. The warmth that once kissed the fields, the gentle breeze that had once danced through open windows, now faded, as if the earth itself was slowly falling asleep. In the villages of medieval Europe, people knew the signs. The geese flew lower in the sky. The leaves, once proud in their green coats, now trembled in the wind. Dry, brittle, turning gold, then brown, then gone. They fell like quiet prayers onto the earth, blanketing paths and roofs in soft whispers of farewell. The air smelled different. It was sharper now, thinner. You could feel it in your bones. Even the animals seemed to know. Dogs curled tighter. In their corners, cats no longer wandered far. The birds grew quieter, their songs replaced by the soft rustle of branches stripped bare. People began to prepare, as they always did. But preparation was never enough. Not really. The women gathered the last of the herbs, sage, thyme, rosemary, tying them in bundles, hanging them from wooden beams to dry. Their hands moved quickly, fingers stiff from the creeping chill, but they worked with the quiet knowledge passed down from mothers and grandmothers. That winter waits for no one. The men stacked firewood, endless stacks of firewood. Oak if you were lucky, ash if you were poor, damp pine if you were desperate. Each log carefully split, lined and covered, knowing full well that the cold would soon gnaw through even the strongest doors. Children helped where they could, gathering kindling, chasing away the crows that seemed to gather more often now. Black shapes against gray skies, like little warnings from the heavens. The wind changed direction. It now came from the north, colder, sharper, carrying with it the first promises of snow, the kind of snow that doesn't melt when it touches the ground, but lingers, builds. Waits in the fields, nothing remained but stubble. The wheat was gone. The barley was stored, or at least, what could be saved from the rats? Turnips and onions were buried deep beneath the earth, hidden like treasures waiting to be unearthed in darker months. The rivers slowed, their surfaces shimmered with thin layers of ice in the early mornings, fragile mirrors that cracked beneath the weight of even the smallest pebble. People hurried now. Time was running out. Roofs were patched with bundles of straw. Leaks were sealed with clay or mud. Windows, those that had them, were covered with scraps of cloth soaked in wax or fat, anything to keep the wind out. Most homes had no glass, it's only holes, that the cold would soon slip through like a thief. Inside, smoke from the hearth began to cling to everything, walls, hair, clothes, but no one complained. Smoke meant warmth, Warmth was precious. The days shrank. Morning became a blink. Afternoon felt like twilight. Night stretched endlessly. Hours that once belonged to work or play were now given to survival. To sitting close, to breathing slow, to listening for the smallest sound that might mean something worse was coming in the distance. Wolves howled. Their voices carried over hills and through the bare branches of the forests. Some said they sang to the moon. Others said it was hunger. But everyone agreed. The wolves were closer now, braver, hungrier. The roads once busy with carts and traders grew empty. Merchants hurried to close their journeys before the snow made travel impossible. The blacksmith finished his last orders, knowing few would need new horseshoes in the months when the earth turned to ice. The baker made extra loaves, but even he knew flour does not stretch forever, and so, the waiting began. The coming of the cold part too, as the days slipped quietly toward winter's embrace, the sounds of life grew softer. Footsteps on dirt roads were now muffled by fallen leaves, and soon by something even quieter, snow. The distant hammering from the blacksmith faded. The cheerful chatter of farmers in their fields disappeared. What remained was the low whisper of the wind, and the occasional cry of a raven circling high above. The wind had teeth now, bit at fingers and noses, slipped under woolen cloaks, and seeped through even the thickest walls. No matter how tightly doors were shut or how many furs were layered over shoulders, the cold always found a way. It was clever that way, sneaking through cracks, dancing beneath doors, crawling between floorboards. In the small stone churches that stood in every village, the bells rang less often. People prayed not for riches or victory, but for mercy. Mercy from the long night. Mercy from the hunger that always seemed to follow the frost. Candles flickered before wooden altars. The soft smell of melting wax mingled with damp air, and the faint scent of old wood and dust. The markets were nearly empty now. Where once there were baskets overflowing with apples, cheeses, fresh bread, and salted meats. Now there were only a few tired vendors, selling onions, maybe a little honey, maybe some smoked fish, but even these were fading. Coins grew scarce. People began to trade instead a spool of thread for a sack of grain, an old cloak for a bundle of firewood, and still. The cold came. By mid-November, the first snow arrived. It didn't ask permission. It didn't wait for anyone to be ready. It simply fell, slow at first, soft as feathers, but steady. Covering the rooftops in pale blankets, filling the gaps between cobblestones, dusting the branches until they bent under its weight, children for a moment laughed. They ran outside, catching flakes on their tongues, leaving footprints in the fresh powder. But even their laughter sounded quieter, as though the snow swallowed sound itself. Inside the homes, families gathered closer. The hearth became the heart of the house. Every task moved nearer to its warmth. Spinning wool, carving wood, grinding grain. Shadows flickered against the walls, long and thin, dancing to the rhythm of the fire. Outside, the animals suffered too. Cows stood close in their stalls, their breath rising in little clouds. Chickens stopped laying eggs, huddling together for warmth. Pigs grew restless, sniffing at the frozen earth, confused by a world that had suddenly turned white. The rivers, once flowing and full of life, slowed further. Thin ice, then thick. Soon, the water disappeared beneath solid sheets of frost, silent and unmoving. No fishing now, no washing, just ice. And the quiet groaning sound it made when it shifted. Under the weight of the world, travel became dangerous. Paths vanished under snow. What was once a road now looked like any other patch of land. People got lost. Even when trying to go no farther than the next village, some never returned. The forests, those dark and mysterious places on the edges of every town, became both a danger and a lifeline. They held firewood, and maybe, if luck favored, a rabbit or a deer. But they also held wolves, and sometimes, worse. Bandits. Men driven by the same hunger, by the same desperation. The cold was not just outside now. It pressed against bones. It lived in the fingertips and the toes. Frostbite was common. Fingers turned black. The toes. As well, sometimes they had to be cut away. There was no medicine for that. Only fire. In prayers, frost crawled across the insides of windows. Thin, delicate patterns like lace spun by winter itself. Some children traced them with their fingers, pretending the frost was a kind of magic. But the adults knew better. It was a warning, a reminder that the cold was not finished. Not yet. Not for many months still. Nights became endless. The sun barely climbed over the hills before it began sinking again. Whole days felt like twilight, a world trapped between dark and darker. People slept more, or tried to. Sometimes, the cold made even sleep impossible, and in the deepest hours of night, when the fire burned low, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath, people listened. To the creaking of their own homes under the weight of snow, to the distant howls that rose and fell like sad songs carried on the wind. To the soft, steady drip of melting icicles as they froze again, they listened, and they waited, 'cause waiting was all that could be done. The The Coming of the Cold Part 3. The cold was not a guest. It was a ruler, a silent, heavy king who came uninvited, stayed far too long. In the hearts of medieval villages, every home became a tiny island. Surrounded by endless seas of white, the snow grew taller, swallowing fences, burying pathways, and hiding the lines between road and field. Trees, once full of life, stood stiff and bare, their branches stretched upward like bony fingers, reaching for a sky that offered no warmth. Only gray clouds and more snow. The roof sagged under heavy drifts. Wooden beams creaked, moaned, and sometimes cracked. Men climbed ladders to push the weight away, praying that the roof would hold for one more night, one more storm. Beneath those roofs, fires burned, small and precious, flames flickering like tiny promises that life still held on, but fire needed fuel, and fuel was never enough. The piles of firewood, once towering and proud in the yard, shrank faster than anyone wanted to admit. Each morning, another armful vanished into the flames. Each night, someone asked quietly, "How much do we have?" Left, no one ever wanted to answer. Some ventured out, into the forest, searching for fallen branches, for anything dry enough to burn. But the snow covered everything. What could be found was often wet, frozen, or claimed by others. Sometimes, a man returned empty-handed. Sometimes, he did not return at all. Inside, mothers boiled water with nothing in it but hope. Thin soups, sometimes flavored with a bone long since stripped of meat. Children sipped it slowly, pretending it was enough. Pretending it was food, the days became strange things. Measured not by the ticking of clocks, for there were none, but by the rhythm of the fire. The chores that remained, and the light that crept weakly through small windows before vanishing again. And yet, life did not stop. Men mended tools. Women spun wool, their fingers moving by memory more than sight, weaving threads into cloth, cloth into warmth, warmth into survival. Grandmothers told stories not just to pass the time, but to remind their families that the cold had come before, and it always eventually left. Stories of winters worse than this, of snow so deep it covered the chapel's bell, of frost so cruel that rivers froze solid all the way to the bottom, trapping fish in frozen prisons of glass, of years when the wolves came into the village, bold enough to steal chickens, bold enough to snatch a child if no one watched closely. But also stories of spring, of how one day the sun would return, how the snow would melt, slow at first, then faster, revealing brown earth beneath, of how the rivers would crack open, laughing their cold, rushing songs of how green would return, as it always did. In the meantime, there was work, always work, sewing torn cloaks, repairing broken shoes, sharpening knives, mending pots, weaving baskets, work that kept the hands busy, and the mind away from darker thoughts. But the mind wandered anyway. Some thought of those who had left before the snows, traveling south, toward warmer lands, never to return. Some wondered if they had been wise, or if they had simply traded one kind of hardship for another. Others remembered the graves, shallow earth barely covered before the frost came, crosses now leaning, half buried in snow. There were always more graves in winter, and then there were the wolves. Their howls came more often now, not just distant echoes, but closer. Sometimes too close, a sound at the edge of the woods, a glimpse of yellow eyes between the trees. Sometimes paw prints just outside the door in the morning. Fathers sat by the window with spears or axes. WATCHING waiting. Children were told not to stray, not even a few steps, not even to fetch water from the well, because even the well might be watched, by something hungry. The cold did not kill quickly. It was patient. It waited. Crept first. It stole the feeling from fingers. Then toes. A numbness that seemed harmless. until the skin turned pale, then blue, then black. Frostbite was a quiet thief. You never felt it until it had already taken something from you. Some burned furniture when the woodpile was gone. A chair, a table. Some stripped the thatch from their own roofs, knowing that a leak in spring was better than freezing in winter. And yet, every morning, someone stirred the embers, coaxed a flame, and began again. Because that's what winter taught them, that life was stubborn, that even when the world grew cold and the nights grew longer than anyone thought possible, life still found a way to whisper back, I am still here. The coming of the cold part, for there were nights, when even the fire seemed tired, flames danced low, blue at the edges, flickering as though unsure if they wished to go on. The shadows on the walls grew longer, darker, and the cold pressed closer, as if it too were alive, as if it breathed, and waited, Just beyond the light, people whispered of strange things in winters like this. Shapes seen between the trees, footsteps in snow where no person had walked, figure far off that vanished. When one tried to look directly, some said the forest itself grew restless, its bare branches creaking not just from the wind, but from something else, something old, older than the villages, older than even the memory of the people who lived there. But whether it was truth, or simply a mind trying to fill the silence, no one knew. The silence was its own kind of weight, heavy, endless. In summer, the world had been filled with sound, the hum of bees, the laughter of neighbors, the calling of birds, the creak of cartwheels over dirt, but now, all was muffled. Snow absorbed every noise, like thick wool wrapped around the earth. Even voices sounded softer, as if they too were afraid of waking something. Sometimes in the darkest part of night, the sky would clear, and there above the frozen world stretched the stars, cold, sharp, unblinking, a sky so wide, so endless, that it made those looking up feel both comforted and very small. The stars had seen every winter before. They would see every winter yet to come. Fathers sat by the fire, their hands wrapped around wooden cups of broth, thin but hot. They stared into the flames, not speaking. Mothers pulled their children close, rubbing their arms, their feet, their cheeks, anything to keep the cold from slipping in. Babies cried less in winter, perhaps because even crying took too much energy. The old ones, the grandmothers, the grandfathers, told stories of saints who had once walked these lands, of spirits in the snow, of winters when entire rivers disappeared under ice, so thick that horses could walk across them, and when they did, the ice sang beneath their feet, a strange, mournful sound, like the world itself sighing. Not all stories were sad. Some were meant to make the little ones smile, tales of clever foxes, of foolish kings, of magical animals who could speak in the hour before dawn on Christmas Day. If only someone were awake and brave enough to listen. But even the happiest stories ended with a familiar closing. And then spring came. Double quotes, always. The promise of spring. The whisper that this too shall pass, because it must. It always had. It always would. The days were measured. Now in the simplest things, how much would remain? How much grain? Whether the icicles growing from the eaves were getting shorter, longer. Whether the snow felt softer underfoot, harder, colder, sharper. Sometimes it rained, even in winter. A cold, biting rain that turned snow to ice, made paths slippery and roofs dangerous. Icicles grew as thick as a man's arm, hanging like glass swords from the edges of homes. People walked carefully, heads down, not just from habit, but from the real fear that one of those icy daggers might fall. And yet, amid all this, there were still moments of strange, quiet beauty. The way the sunlight caught the frost in the morning, turning every tree into silver lace. The perfect stillness of the forest after a snowfall, not a sound, not a movement, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The gentle crunch of snow under boots, the warmth of a hand reaching for yours in the dark, and the knowledge, shared by all, they were not alone. No one in the village escaped the cold. No one was spared the hunger, the fear, the long aching nights. But together, they endured. Each family, each home, a tiny point of light against the vast dark of winter, and so, each day they rose, they fed the fire. They mended what could be mended. They told the stories. They shared what little they had, and they waited because they knew, in the deepest part of their hearts, that even the longest winter must someday end. The Coming of the Cold Part 5. But before spring could even dare to stretch her fingers toward the frozen ground, winter deepened its grip. The cold grew heavier, sharper, more stubborn, as if it sensed that time was slipping away and wanted to remind all living things who held power. For now the snow did not simply fall. It pressed against roofs, pressed against doors, pressed against the spirits of those who lay awake in the long, endless nights. It filled the narrow spaces between stones, climbed the sides of houses until windows showed nothing but white. Paths that were once familiar, disappeared, inside. Breath floated in the air, tiny clouds of warmth quickly stolen by the chill. People wrapped cloth around their mouths just to breathe without pain. Blankets were layered over cloaks, furs over blankets, but still, the cold found its way in. Sometimes, it felt as though the cold wasn't just something outside, but something inside as well. It crept beneath the skin, into bones, into thoughts. People became quieter, slower. The smallest tasks, fetching water, feeding the animals, stirring the fire, felt like climbing mountains. Water froze in wooden buckets. Bread, when it could be found, turned hard as stone. Knives had to be heated in the fire before they could slice through it.
And milk froze solid.
Even ale and wine, once thought to ward off the chill, became thick, slushy, or ice altogether, and yet life insisted on going forward. In the barns, the animals huddled close. Cows leaned into one another, their hides steaming in the cold. Pigs buried themselves in straw, grunting softly as their breath rose in frosty clouds. Chickens grew silent, their feathers fluffed as large as possible, their combs pale from the chill. Even the strongest beasts, the oxen, the horses, seemed smaller now, humbled by a season that cared little for strength. Outside, the forest stood frozen, waiting. Trees wore coats of ice, their limbs bending under the weight. Sometimes, a sudden crack echoed through the hills, a branch breaking free, crashing down into the snow below. And then, silence again, heavy. Total, the forest could no longer be trusted. Wolves left their hunting grounds deeper in the woods, creeping closer to the edges of villages. In the mornings, fresh tracks circled homes, stables, and chicken. Coop's large paw prints, perfectly round, so precise in the snow, they seemed almost drawn. People told stories of eyes glowing in the dark, of shapes moving just beyond the firelight, while most stories were meant to frighten children into staying indoors. Everyone, young and old, felt the truth beneath the tales. Even the rivers were gone now, frozen, covered in snow, so deep that the water beneath was only a memory. The wells became the only source of water. But sometimes, even those froze shut. Their wooden lids sealed under sheets of ice that had to be chipped away every morning, and so, every task became slower, harder, more dangerous. A trip to the forest for wood was no longer a short errand, but a full day's gamble. Would the snow be too deep? Would the wolves come too close? Would the cold steal your strength before the task was done? And yet, men still went. Women still sewed. Children still gathered what twigs they could find near the edges of paths. Life, stubborn as moss between stones, held on inside. The world shrank to the size of a single room, a fire at the center, A few straw mattresses pushed as close as possible to its warmth. Every pot, every tool, every garment hung near the flames, hoping to stay dry, to stay useful at night. People lay shoulder to shoulder not just for comfort, but for survival. The warmth of another body was not a luxury. It was life itself. Even those who rarely spoke during brighter days now found themselves leaning close, breathing the same thin, smoky air, bound together by the simple need to stay alive. The youngest would sometimes ask, "When will the snow go?" The answer was always the same, a sigh, a soft smile. Soon, little one. Soon was still so far away, and so the winter sat heavy upon them, a quiet tyrant, ruling not with armies but with silence, with snow, with the slow, creeping bite of cold that slipped through wood, stone, and bone. It was a test that came every year, but always felt new, no matter how many winters one had seen. Each felt as though it might be the one that would not end. Yet, beneath the frozen sky, beneath roofs sagging with snow, beneath cloaks worn thin, something else stirred, something softer than the howl of the wolves, quieter than the snow falling on the rooftops, and gentler than the firelight flickering. On the walls, it was the simple, stubborn heartbeat of hope, a hope that whispered, "The cold cannot last forever," a hope that reminded them, "The sun still waits beyond the clouds," hope carried in the stories told by trembling lips, in the songs hummed softly against the dark, in the warmth of hands held close, because even the harshest winter, even the longest night, cannot stop the turning of the world, somewhere far away where snow did not yet fall. The earth was already beginning its slow secret work. Seeds slept beneath the frost, rivers waited beneath their icy prisons, and the sun, tired though it seemed, had not abandoned them. It would return, it always did. And so they waited. And so they endured, wrapped in silence, wrapped in snow, wrapped in the fragile but unbreakable thread that ties all living things to the promise of spring, a promise as old as the first fire, as quiet as falling snow, and as certain as the turning of the earth.